Imagine a world where the water is sweet, where the salt of the ocean is a distant, unknown concept, and the horizon is defined not by crashing waves, but by the glassy stillness of a giant mirror. Thousands of years ago, long before the first stone was laid for the Great Pyramid, a vast inland sea sat nestled between the mountains of the Caucasus and the rolling hills of the Balkans. But it was not a sea as we know it today. It was a giant freshwater lake, a tranquil sanctuary of life that the ancients would later call the Euxine. In this deep time, roughly 7,500 years before our present era, the geography of the world was still recovering from the last great ice age. The massive glaciers had retreated north, leaving behind a scarred but fertile landscape. As the ice melted, the global sea levels began their slow, inexorable rise, but for a long time the Euxine Lake remained isolated, protected by a thin strip of land that acted as a natural dam. This land bridge, located where the modern city of Istanbul now stands, kept the rising Mediterranean at bay, allowing a unique and peaceful world to flourish in the basin below. The air around the lake is heavy with the scent of damp earth and wild grasses. Mist clings to the valleys in the early morning, swirling around the knees of oak and willow trees that line the shore. It is a place of profound silence, broken only by the soft lap of fresh water against the silt and the distant call of water birds. Here, the rhythm of life is slow and measured, dictated by the seasons and the gentle migration of fish. On the fertile plains surrounding the water, small communities of Neolithic people have begun to settle. These are the early farmers and gatherers, people who have learned to work with the land rather than simply moving across it. They build their homes from timber and clay, creating small clusters of life that dot the emerald green landscape. To them, the lake is everything. It is their source of life, their primary highway, and perhaps, in their quietest moments, their deity. As you settle in for the night, perhaps adjusting your pillow or pulling the blankets a little closer, I want to welcome you to this journey through the deep past. You are listening to the Slumber Archives, and if you find comfort in these stories from long ago, you are certainly not alone. We gather here every single day to explore the forgotten corners of history together, and if you enjoy these narrations, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to the channel. It ensures you never miss a night of storytelling, and a simple like on this video helps our community grow so that others might find rest here as well. Now, let us return to that quiet basin where the water is still sweet and the world feels eternal. The archaeology of this region tells a story of remarkable stability. When researchers use radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to determine the age of organic materials, they find evidence of a culture that remained largely unchanged for centuries. These people were part of a wider tapestry of human expansion, yet they lived in a pocket of the world that felt protected from the harsher realities of the shifting climate. The stratigraphy of the lake bed, the layers of sediment laid down over millennia, shows that for a very long time the Euxine was a closed system. It was a basin of antiquity, a cradle of early civilization, where the soil was rich and the winters were mild. We often think of the ancient world as a place of constant struggle, but in these mist-covered valleys there was a sense of abundance. The lake was teeming with sturgeon and carp, and the forests were thick with deer and wild boar. The people of the Euxine shore did not know that they were living in a bowl, hundreds of feet below the level of the world ocean. To them, the hills that surrounded the lake were the edges of the universe. They had no way of knowing that on the other side of the Bosporus Ridge, the Mediterranean Sea was rising, inch by agonizing inch, fed by the melting remnants of the great ice sheets. There is a certain melancholy in looking back at this peaceful landscape, knowing what was to come. It is a reminder of the limits of what we know, of how fragile our most stable environments truly are. In the context of deep time, the lives of these early farmers were but a heartbeat. yet they existed in a world that felt as solid and permanent as the mountains themselves. As the years passed, the pressure against the natural dam to the southwest grew. The Mediterranean was pressing against the gates, searching for any weakness in the earth. But for the people of the lake, life continued in its gentle, repetitive cycle. They decorated their pottery with swirling patterns, perhaps mimicking the ripples on the water. They traded obsidian and flint, and they watched the stars move across a sky that was free from the glow of any city. The atmosphere was one of profound stillness, a quietude that we can barely imagine in our modern, noisy world. It was a time of long shadows and deep reflections. We must wonder what they thought of the rising damp in certain areas, or if they noticed the salt spray beginning to crest the distant hills on particularly stormy nights. The evidence of their lives is buried deep beneath the silt of the modern Black Sea, hidden under hundreds of feet of salt water that arrived with a violence that would change the world forever. But before the chaos, there was this, a serene, freshwater paradise where the morning mist felt like a promise of another quiet day. The Euxine Lake was a world apart, a prehistoric garden, where humanity took its first tentative steps toward the complex societies that would follow. As we drift further into the history of this great deluge, hold on to this image of the quiet basin, the scent of the willow trees, the cool touch of the fresh water, and the deep, abiding silence of a world that did not yet know it was about to end. It is in these forgotten ages that we find the echoes of our own story, whispered through the layers of time and the depths of the dark, still water. The air begins to change, not with a sudden storm, but with a subtle, creeping warmth that arrives over the span of 1,000 years. It is a slow exhaling of the earth, a softening of the frost that had gripped the northern hemispheres for 20 millennia. If we could stand upon the high ridges of the Balkan Mountains during this era, we would feel the wind lose its razor edge, replaced by a humidity that carries the scent of damp earth and waking moss. This was the waning of the last glacial maximum, the peak of the Great Ice Age, when the world was a cathedral of white and blue, silent and frozen. But now the sun lingers a little longer each evening, and the great white sheets that smothered the north begin to weep. To understand the fate of the Black Sea Basin, we must look far to the north, toward the Scandinavian mountains and the vast plains of northern Europe. There, the ice was miles thick, a weight so immense that it had pressed the very crust of the earth downward. As the climate shifts, this frozen kingdom begins to fail. It is a process that defies human scales of time, a steady, rhythmic dripping that turns into a trickle, then a stream, and eventually a roar. This is the melting of the glaciers, a release of ancient waters that had been locked away for eons. As they dissolve, they do not simply vanish, they seek the lowest point. They carve through the landscape, creating the great river systems of the Danube, the Dnieper, and the Don, all of which carry the frigid meltwater toward the quiet, low-lying freshwater lake we now call the Black Sea. For a time the basin swells. The lake rises as the northern ice feeds it, turning the once arid plains into a lush green sanctuary. But the world is changing on a global scale, and the rise of the lake is nothing compared to the rise of the world's oceans. As the great ice sheets of North America and Eurasia collapse into the sea, the global water level begins to climb. It is a slow, relentless ascent, an inch every few years, a foot every decade. Across the planet, coastlines are being redrawn. Land bridges that once connected continents are vanishing beneath the waves, and the geography of our ancestors is being erased, one beachhead at a time. The Mediterranean Sea, once a series of isolated basins, fills and deepens, pushing its salt-heavy waters further inland, reclaiming the sun-drenched valleys of the south. While the world warms, there is a brief, mysterious stutter in the recovery of the climate, a period archaeologists and geologists call the Younger Dryas. It is a name derived from a small white alpine flower that suddenly reappeared in the fossil record of Europe, signifying a sharp 1,000-year return to glacial cold. We might think of it as a final, desperate gasp of the Ice Age. During this millennium, the melting slows, the rivers thin. The people living along the shores of the freshwater lake likely felt a sense of reprieve, or perhaps a new kind of hardship as the temperatures plummeted once more. But even this cold snap is merely a pause in the inevitable. When the younger Dryas finally breaks, the warming returns with a renewed, almost violent intensity. The ice resumes its retreat, and the sea levels take up their steady, upward march once again. As the centuries drift by, the Mediterranean begins to exert a terrifying pressure against its boundaries. To the east, the only thing separating the rising salt water from the deep, sunken basin of the Black Sea is a narrow strip of land, the Bosporus land bridge. Today, we know this area as the gateway between Europe and Asia, the site of the ancient city of Byzantium, but in those days it was a solid earthen dam, a rugged ridge of rock and sediment that held the weight of an entire sea at bay. On one side, the Mediterranean, or more specifically, the Sea of Marmara, is climbing higher and higher, fueled by the melting poles. On the other side, hundreds of feet below, lies the peaceful freshwater lake, its inhabitants unaware of the watery mountain looming just over the horizon. Imagine the physics of this moment, the sheer, silent weight of the water pressing against that natural levee. It is a tension that builds over generations, a slow-motion collision between the rising ocean and the static land. The salt water is heavy, dense, and relentless. It seeks any crack, any low point in the ridge, any weakness in the stone. We can almost hear the subterranean groans of the earth as the pressure increases. The groundwater begins to seep through the soil. Perhaps the springs near the ridge turn brackish, a subtle warning that the sea is knocking at the door. But for the people living in the basin below, life continues. They hunt the red deer in the forests. They gather the wild grains. They watch the stars and tell stories of their ancestors, never imagining that the very geography of their world is held in place by a single, thinning strip of earth. The stratigraphy, the study of the layers of soil and rock that serve as the Earth's diary, tells us a story of a world in transition. In these layers, we see the shift from freshwater minerals to saltwater sediments, a clear line in the sand that marks the moment the environment changed forever. But before that line is drawn, there is a period of agonizing suspense in the geological record. The Mediterranean is like a cup filled to the very brim, the surface tension of the water bulging over the rim, waiting for the slightest disturbance to send it cascading over. The land bridge is being eroded from both sides, by the rising sea from the south and by the natural weathering of the landscape. It is no longer a question of if the barrier will fail, but when. As we contemplate this looming catastrophe, we must wonder about the limits of human memory. How much of this pressure was sensed by the people of the time? Did they notice the sea encroaching on the other side of the hills? Or was the scale of the change so vast, so much larger than a single human lifetime, that it remained invisible to them? We often think of history as a series of intentional acts, of wars and kings and discoveries, but here, in the deep time of the early Holocene, the primary actor is the earth itself. The warming atmosphere, the shifting currents, and the melting ice are the forces that dictate the rhythm of life. We are merely passengers on a planet that is constantly reshaping itself, indifferent to the civilizations that sprout in its fertile valleys. The Bosporus land bridge becomes a focal point of cosmic tension. It is the final thread holding back a deluge of biblical proportions. As the Mediterranean continues to swell, the difference in height between the two bodies of water becomes staggering. Some estimates suggest the sea was more than 300 feet higher than the lake below. This is not merely a difference in level. It is a reservoir of potential energy, a coiled spring of hydraulic force waiting to be released. The silence of the basin, that quiet freshwater world we visualized earlier, is now a fragile thing. It is a world living on borrowed time, protected by a wall that is slowly, inevitably, turning to mud. The transition from the Ice Age to the modern era was not a smooth one. It was a series of fits and starts, of sudden floods and long droughts, and in this particular corner of the world, the transition was destined to be cataclysmic. The weight of the Mediterranean is now so great that the land bridge begins to fail. Not all at once, perhaps. Maybe it starts with a small breach during a particularly high tide or a storm surge, a silver finger of salt water reaching over the crest and trickling down the northern slope. A small stream that begins to eat away at the soft earth, carving a tiny channel that grows wider with every passing hour. This is the moment where the mystery deepens. How long did that first trickle last? Was there a period of years where only a small waterfall tumbled into the basin, a curiosity for any traveller who happened to wander near the ridge? Or was the failure of the land bridge a sudden structural collapse? The evidence is buried deep beneath the silt of the modern Black Sea, hidden under thousands of years of salt and darkness. We look to the core samples, the long tubes of mud pulled from the seafloor, searching for the transition from the grey, freshwater clay to the dark, organic, rich marine mud. That transition represents the end of one world and the violent birth of another. It is the signature of the flood, written in the language of the earth. As the warmth of the sun continues to melt the distant glaciers, the pressure reaches its breaking point. The earth can no longer sustain the burden. The ridge, once a sturdy bridge for animals and men, is now a crumbling dam. The Mediterranean, vast and blue and salt-heavy, is ready to reclaim the deep. We are standing on the precipice of a transformation that will haunt the collective memory of humanity for thousands of years, a story of water and loss that will be told in every tongue and every corner of the globe. But for now, the sun sets over a still basin, the willow trees dip their branches into the fresh water, and the air is filled with the scent of a world that is blissfully unaware of the wall of water gathering just beyond the hills. The great ice has retreated, and in its wake it has left a world poised for a catastrophe that will change everything. Deep beneath the modern surface of the Bosporus, where the currents of the Marmara and the Black Seas now dance in a turbulent embrace, there once lay a silent guardian, a massive earthen plug of rock and sediment that held two worlds apart. This was the Bosporus Threshold, a natural dam formed over millions of years by the shifting plates of the Anatolian fault and the slow, grinding patience of geological time. It was not a thin wall, but a broad, undulating ridge of limestone and hard-packed clay rising several hundred feet above the level of the interior basin. For ages it stood as a defiant barrier, a continental bridge that allowed early humans and wandering fauna to pass from Europe into Asia with dry feet, never suspecting that the ground beneath them was the only thing preventing a watery apocalypse. As the great ice sheets of the north continued their slow, weeping retreat, the global sea level began its inevitable ascent. The Mediterranean, fed by the melting veins of a warming planet, swelled with a quiet, terrifying persistence. The waters of the Marmara Sea, once a modest inland lake, rose inch by inch, day by day, pressing their salty weight against the southern flank of the Bosporus Ridge. We must imagine the silence of this process, the way the water crept into the low-lying crevices of the rock, filling the hollows where once the wind whistled through dry stone. There was no sudden alarm, no frantic warning, only the steady, rhythmic pulse of the tide, reaching higher and higher, tasting the sun-baked earth of the threshold, as if searching for a weakness. The composition of this natural dam was a complex tapestry of geology. In some places it was anchored by ancient, igneous bedrock, hard and unyielding, but in others it was comprised of softer sedimentary layers, the compressed dust of forgotten eras that had never truly been tested by the force of a rising ocean. As the Mediterranean reached the lip of the ridge, the first trickles of salt water began to spill over. These were not yet the thundering falls of legend, but gentle, shimmering ribbons of blue, weaving through the grasses and overtopping the lowest points of the saddle. To a traveller standing on the ridge, it might have looked like nothing more than a new spring or a seasonal flood, a minor inconvenience on a long journey. But in the language of fluid dynamics and deep time, these trickles were the scouts of an invading army. The salt water, heavier and denser than the fresh water of the Black Sea Basin below, began to exert a subtle but lethal influence on the integrity of the dam. As it trickled down the northern slope, it did not merely flow, it began to erode. The process of overtopping is a slow one until it reaches a critical threshold of its own. The water finds the smallest paths of least resistance. A crack in the limestone, a layer of loose sand, a root system of a dead tree. As the flow increased, these tiny channels began to widen. Each grain of sand carried away by the current served as an abrasive, carving the channel deeper, allowing more water to pass, which in turn accelerated the erosion. This is a feedback loop of destruction, a silent conversation between the water and the stone, where the water always has the final word. The years passed in a state of precarious balance. The threshold was being eaten away from the top down and the inside out. Scientists who study the stratigraphy, that is, the layering of the Earth that acts as a diary of the planet's past, have found evidence of these fluctuating levels. They see the transition from the freshwater sediments of the old lake to the sudden, violent arrival of marine life. But before the final breach, there must have been a period of profound tension. The ground would have been saturated, the once solid land turning into a slurry of mud and broken rock. The very foundations of the Bosporus were being undermined by the relentless pressure of the Mediterranean, which by now stood many dozens of feet higher than the quiet, freshwater world to the north. One can only wonder if the people living on the shores of the Black Sea Lake felt the change in the air. Did they notice the way the springs at the base of the hills began to flow with a strange, brackish tang? Did they hear the distant, low-frequency hum of water moving through the earth, a vibration felt in the soles of the feet rather than heard with the ears? The geological dam was no longer a static object. It was a living, failing thing. The weight of the entire Mediterranean was pushing against a barrier that was becoming increasingly porous. The limestone, riddled with new tunnels and caverns carved by the salt water, was beginning to lose its structural coherence. It was a cathedral of stone with its pillars being slowly dissolved. Then came the moment of structural failure, the point of no return. It may have been triggered by a minor tremor from the fault lines that crisscrossed the region, or perhaps it was simply the weight of one final heavy storm that pushed the Marmara Sea over the limit. The small channels that had been carving their way through the Bosporus suddenly merged. The partitions of earth between them collapsed, and the trickles became a stream. The stream became a river. As the soft sediment was washed away, the harder rock above it lost its support and fell into the growing chasm, creating a chaotic slurry that acted like a giant saw, cutting through the remaining barrier with terrifying speed. The dam did not simply leak. It failed with a catastrophic suddenness that defies our modern understanding of the landscape. In the span of a few days, or perhaps even hours, the ridge that had stood for millennia was gutted. The rock shattered under the immense hydraulic pressure. Imagine the sound, a roar that would have been heard for hundreds of miles, a deep guttural thrumming that shook the very roots of the mountains. The Mediterranean was no longer a guest at the door. It had smashed the door down and was now rushing into the void with a volume of water that is difficult to comprehend. Geologists estimate that at the height of the breach, the flow of water through the new Bosporus Strait was hundreds of times greater than the flow of the mighty Niagara Falls. This was not a flood in the sense of a rising river, it was a flaying of the earth. The force of the water stripped the bedrock bare, tossing boulders the size of houses as if they were pebbles. The salt water plunged down the northern slope of the ridge, falling hundreds of feet into the freshwater basin below, creating a plume of mist that must have blotted out the sun for miles. The air itself would have been whipped into a frenzy by the sheer movement of the water, creating localized storms and winds that roared through the valley. As the barrier gave way, the geography of the world was rewritten in a heartbeat. The two continents, once joined by the sturdy Bosporus Ridge, were now forever severed by a churning ribbon of white water and blue brine. The threshold was gone, and in its place was a wound in the earth that would never heal. The fresh waters of the old lake, which had sustained life for so long in its quiet isolation, were about to be overwhelmed by the ancient, salty depths of the world's oceans. The balance had tipped, and the weight of the sea was now falling upon a world that had no defense against it. In the depths of our collective subconscious, perhaps this is the moment we remember. The sound of the earth breaking, the sight of the horizon turning into a wall of falling water. The Bosporus Threshold was the last line of defense for a forgotten civilization, and when it fell, it did not go quietly. It surrendered with a violence that would echo through the stories of every culture that followed, a literal breaking of the world that signaled the end of one age and the chaotic, drowning birth of another. The water was coming, and there was nowhere left to run. It begins not as a roar, but as a low, rhythmic vibration that travels through the soles of the feet long before it reaches the ears. Imagine standing upon the limestone ridge of the Bosporus nearly 8,000 years ago, looking out over a landscape that had remained unchanged for generations. To your north lies the Euxine Lake, a vast, placid expanse of cool, fresh water, its shores lined with the settlements of a people who have built their lives around its predictable tides. To your south, the Marmara Sea presses against the earth, swollen by the melting glaciers of a warming world, rising inch by agonizing inch until the pressure becomes a physical force, a weight that the crumbling land can no longer sustain. When the breach finally occurs, it is an act of geological surrender. The rock groans and splinters, sending tremors through the silt, and then the first thin veil of salt water spills over the lip of the valley. It is a silver thread at first, almost delicate, but within hours that thread becomes a torrent, and within days it becomes a cataclysm that defies human comprehension. The sound is what would have stayed with you, a deep, percussive thrumming that seems to shake the very atmosphere. It is the sound of the Mediterranean Sea, a body of water larger than many continents, forcing its way through a narrow throat of land. As the gap widens, the trickle transforms into a gargantuan flume. Modern oceanographers and geologists, peering back through the layers of time using seismic imaging and core samples, have attempted to quantify the scale of this event. They speak of a flow rate that reaches 50 cubic kilometers of water every single day. To visualize this, one must imagine the combined power of 200 Niagara Falls, all concentrated into a single screaming channel. The sheer kinetic energy of this movement would have stripped the soil from the bedrock, grinding boulders into powder and carving a deep, jagged scar into the earth that we still see today on the floor of the Bosporus Strait. As the water cascades down the slope, dropping over 100 meters from the high sea to the low lake, it creates a visual spectacle of terrifying beauty. The salt water, denser and heavier than the fresh water of the lake, does not simply mix upon impact. Instead, it plunges downward, forming a massive underwater plume of turquoise and white foam that drives deep into the dark heart of the basin. From a distance, it would have looked like a solid pillar of water, a permanent wall of falling ocean that obscured the horizon in a shroud of mist and spray. The air around the breach would have been thick with the scent of brine and ancient mud, a sharp metallic smell that signaled the end of the lake's purity. For the people living on the distant shores, the first sign of the world breaking might not have been the sight of the water, but the change in the sky. A permanent cloud of vapor rising in the south, glowing with the reflected light of a sun that was setting on their way of life. The physics of such an event are almost impossible to grasp when we consider the stillness that usually defines deep time. We often think of the Earth's changes as occurring over millions of years, a slow, imperceptible crawl of tectonic plates and eroding hills. But the Black Sea Deluge is a reminder that nature is capable of sudden, violent punctuation marks. The water was moving at speeds of over 80 kilometers per hour, a liquid freight train that nothing could withstand. As the Mediterranean poured in, it brought with it the life of the ocean, salt, seaweeds, and marine creatures that had never before touched the fresh waters of the Euxine. This was a biological invasion as much as a geological one. The lake, which had been a sanctuary of life for the Neolithic people, was being poisoned by the very element that sustained it. The fresh water was being buried under a layer of salt, creating an anoxic environment, a place without oxygen, in the deepest trenches of the basin, a dark, silent tomb where the remnants of this lost world would be preserved for millennia. And so the basin began to fill. It was not a flash flood that retreated after a few hours, but a relentless, rising tide that moved inland day after day, week after week. Calculations suggest that the water level of the lake rose by as much as 15 centimeters every single day. For someone living on the flat, low-lying coastal plains, this meant the shoreline was moving toward them at a rate of nearly a kilometer every 24 hours. You could walk away from the water for an entire day, only to wake up the next morning and find the waves lapping at your feet once again. There was no high ground that felt safe, no landmark that remained permanent. The familiar paths to the forest, the ancestral burial grounds, the fields where the first grains were being gathered, all were swallowed by a rising blue line that seemed to have no end. As the years passed and the lake expanded into the sea, we recognize today the psychological impact on the survivors must have been profound. To witness the ocean breaking through the mountains is to witness the impossible. It is a moment where the foundations of reality are shaken, where the gods seem to have turned their backs on the order of the world. This was not merely a flood, it was a transformation of the map itself. The Bosporus was no longer a valley, but a gateway. The Euxine was no longer a lake, but a limb of the great world ocean. The salt water plume continued its descent until the levels finally equalized, but by then the world that had existed before was gone, submerged under hundreds of feet of water, hidden away in a cold, dark realm where the sun would never reach again. One cannot help but wonder about the silence that followed the initial chaos. Once the breach had widened to its full extent and the roar of the falls had softened into the steady flow of a strait, a heavy, eerie quiet must have settled over the new coastline. The birds that once nested in the reeds would have fled, the animals that drank from the fresh springs would have retreated into the hills. All that remained was the vast, shimmering expanse of the new sea, hiding the secrets of the drowned villages beneath its surface. We are left to piece together the story from the fragments of shell and the ripples in the sand, trying to hear the echo of that great falling water through the thick veil of 8,000 years. It is a story of a world that broke in a single day, a reminder of how fragile our borders truly are when the deep earth decides to move. The Mediterranean did not just fill a basin, it rewrote the history of a continent, leaving us to look at the waves and wonder what else lies forgotten beneath the blue. Imagine the sound of a distant, low-frequency hum, a vibration that begins not in the ears, but in the soles of the feet, travelling up through the soft silt and the roots of the grass. For the people living on the vast northern plains of what we now call the Euxine Lake, the end of their world does not arrive as a sudden wall of foam, but as a relentless, shimmering line on the horizon that refuses to stop moving. This is the northern shelf, a territory so flat and expansive that even a modest rise in water level translates into miles of lost ground. As the Mediterranean continues its violent descent through the Bosporus, the pressure forces the lake to expand outward, claiming the land with a methodical, terrifying grace. The shoreline does not merely creep, it gallops. On these level plains, the water advances by as much as a mile in a single day, a pace that outstrips the ability of a forest to adapt or a village to relocate its heavy stores. We can picture the scene through the lens of deep time. A hunter returns to his camp only to find the familiar path through the reeds is now a shallow stream. By the following morning, that stream is a river. By the end of the week, the camp itself is a memory, resting beneath 10 feet of brackish, swirling water. There is a profound stillness in this kind of catastrophe, a slow-motion erasure of a landscape that had remained unchanged for thousands of years. The tall grasses of the steppe, gold and brittle under the sun, are bowed down by the weight of the salt-heavy tide, turning into ghostly, undulating ribbons beneath the surface before they finally rot and vanish. Beneath the waves, the ancient forests of the shelf meet a strange and silent fate. These were woods of oak and pine, groves that had sheltered the migrations of deer and the nesting of birds since the retreat of the glaciers. As the inundation sweeps north, these trees are not uprooted by a storm, but drowned where they stand. The water rises past the bark, over the lower branches, until the very crowns are submerged in the dim, green light of the encroaching sea. In the deeper reaches of the Black Sea today, where the oxygen is thin and the currents are weak, the remnants of these drowned forests still exist, preserved in a state of perpetual sunken stasis. They are the skeletal fingers of a lost world, reaching upward toward a surface they will never see again. The river deltas, too, are swallowed whole. The ancient channels of the Danube, the Dnieper, and the Dniester, rivers that had carved wandering paths through the soft earth for millennia, find their mouths suddenly pushed back by hundreds of miles. The fresh water of the interior struggles against the heavy, salt-laden push of the Mediterranean, creating a chaotic mixing zone where the very chemistry of the water begins to change. As the years pass, the transformation of the landscape becomes absolute. What was once a fertile valley, a cradle of life protected by the surrounding mountains, is reshaped into a deep, dark sea. The stratigraphy, that beautiful layered record of the Earth's history found in the soil, tells us exactly when the change occurred. Scientists look for the transition from light-colored lake muds to the dark, organic-rich sediments of a marine environment. They look for the sudden appearance of saltwater mollusks, their tiny shells acting as markers of the great shift. This is the evidence of the inundation, a physical boundary in the earth that separates the world of the lake from the world of the sea. It is a line drawn in the sand by the hand of the ocean, a moment where the geography of a continent was rewritten in a heartbeat of geological time. The plains are gone, replaced by a vast blue void that hides the secrets of those who once walked there. We are left to wonder about the villages that were left behind, the hearths that were extinguished by the rising tide, and the stories that were lost in the rush of the water. The inundation of the plains was not just a change in the map, it was a fundamental shift in the human experience, a reminder that the land we stand upon is only ours for as long as the sea allows. The weight of these forgotten ages hangs heavy over the Black Sea, a silent witness to the day the world broke and the plains became the deep. As the water continues to climb, it finds the ancient riverbeds, the natural highways of the old world. These valleys, once lush with willow and alder, become the primary conduits for the flood. The water rushes up these channels with a newfound intensity, pushing deep into the heart of the northern territories. It is a strange sight, the sea moving inland not as a broad front, but as long silver fingers reaching through the trees. The animals of the plain, the wild horses and the great bison, are forced to retreat, their grazing lands shrinking with every passing hour. They move toward the higher ground of the Carpathian foothills and the Crimean mountains, their paths crossing with the human tribes who are also fleeing the encroaching blue. There is a sense of shared displacement, a collective migration forced by a power that cannot be bargained with or understood. The speed of this advancement creates a unique archaeological phenomenon. Because the water rose so quickly over such a flat area, it did not always have the time to erode the structures it covered. In some places, the silt settled gently over the abandoned settlements, sealing them away like a tomb. This is the promise that haunts the minds of those who study the Black Sea, the possibility that somewhere, beneath hundreds of feet of water and millennia of sediment, there are villages that remain largely intact. Stone foundations, perhaps a stray pottery shard, or the charred remains of a final fire, all held in the cold, anaerobic embrace of the deep. It is a landscape of ghosts, a submerged map of a civilization that had no name, no writing, and no way to tell us what they saw as the horizon turned to water. Eventually, the momentum of the flood begins to stabilize, but the world it leaves behind is unrecognizable. The great Euxine Lake is gone, replaced by a sea that is larger, deeper, and saltier. The northern shelf, once a bridge and a home, is now a vast underwater plateau, a shallow seafloor that masks the true depths beyond. The transformation is complete. The valley has become a sea, and the memory of the plains begins to fade into the realm of myth and legend. We are left to look at the ripples on the surface and imagine the world that lies beneath, a world of drowned forests and silent rivers, forever out of reach, forever part of the mystery of the Great Deluge. Imagine a single ceramic bowl, half buried in the silt of a Neolithic kitchen, its rim chipped not by use, but by the frantic haste of a hand that knew it could never return. For the people living along the northwestern shelf of what was then a freshwater lake, the end did not come with a sudden roar of thunder, but with a persistent rhythmic lapping at the doorframe that simply would not stop. It is one thing to witness a storm that passes with the morning light. It is quite another to realize that the ground beneath your feet is being reclaimed by the abyss, inch by agonizing inch, day after day, until the familiar paths to the well and the grazing meadows are gone forever. Archaeologists, peering through the lens of radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to pin a moment in time, have found a startling silence in the soil layers from roughly 7,600 years ago. Across the coastal reaches of what we now call Bulgaria, Romania, and the northern Turkish coast, there is a visible break in the human story. We see farmsteads that were thriving, with evidence of sophisticated pottery and the early domestication of cattle, suddenly vanishing from the record. There are no signs of war, no charred timbers of a massacre, and no slow decline brought on by drought. Instead, there is the eerie stillness of an abandoned room. The witnesses to this deluge were not primitive wanderers, but settled peoples deeply tied to the rhythms of their land. To them, the earth was the only constant they knew. When the salt water began to push inland, it did not just destroy their crops, it poisoned the very idea of permanence. One can almost see the families gathering what they could carry, the heavy grinding stones for grain left behind as too cumbersome, the larger storage jars abandoned where they stood, still holding the charred remains of last season's harvest. They moved toward the higher ground of the interior, looking back to see the tops of their thatched roofs becoming islands in a rising grey expanse. there is a psychological weight to this kind of loss that is difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp. We live in an era of maps and satellites where the world is measured and known, but for a Neolithic farmer, the horizon was the edge of the universe. To watch that horizon shrink, to see the forests where their ancestors were buried slowly turn into skeletal, salt-bleached graveyards of wood, must have felt like the unravelling of creation itself. The water was not just rising, it was erasing their history. Every step they took away from the encroaching shore was a step into an uncertain future, leaving behind the sacred geography of their lives. In the stratigraphy, the study of the layers of the earth, this event is marked by a sharp transition from the dark, organic mud of a lake to the pale, shell-heavy sands of a sea. Below that line we find the traces of life, the post holes of longhouses, the discarded flint tools, the hearths that once warmed a family through the winter. Above that line there is only the silence of the deep. It is a boundary between two worlds. The people who crossed it carried with them a trauma that likely reshaped the way they viewed the gods and the elements. They became a people in motion, a wave of refugees flowing into the heart of Europe and the mountains of the Caucasus. As the years passed, the stories of the drowned world would have been told around new fires in distant lands. Perhaps this is where the first seeds of the great flood myths were planted, nurtured by the vivid memories of those who had seen the Mediterranean break the world. They would speak of a day when the salt spray reached the wheat fields and the freshwater fish died in the thousands, and the very air began to smell of the vast, brine-filled unknown. We are left to wonder about the things that were not saved. In the haste to escape the rising tide, what small treasures were dropped. A child's toy carved from bone, a necklace of polished stones, a hand-woven basket. These items now lie under hundreds of feet of water, preserved in the cold, oxygen-poor depths of the Black Sea, where the lack of decay acts as a tomb for the Neolithic age. These artifacts are the silent witnesses to a migration that changed the genetic and cultural map of the West. The abandonment was total. The coastal plains, which had been the breadbasket of these early communities, became a forbidden zone. The psychological impact of seeing the world disappear underfoot cannot be overstated. It creates a fundamental shift in the human psyche, a realization that the earth is not a static stage, but a shifting, breathing entity that can, at any moment, reclaim what it has given. As we look at the maps of the ancient shoreline, we see not just geography, but a graveyard of 1,000 lost mornings. And so the refugees moved on, carrying the weight of the deluge in their hearts and the salt of the sea in their stories. The farmsteads were reclaimed by the silt, the forests were claimed by the tides, and the Neolithic Witnesses became the architects of a new world, built on the high ground, far from the reach of the hungry waves. But the memory of the day the water didn't stop rising would linger, a ghost in the collective mind of humanity, waiting for us to dive deep enough to find it once again. Imagine the sound of 1,000 footsteps, muffled by the soft moss and damp earth of a forest floor that has never known the bite of a copper blade. It is a slow, rhythmic progression, a steady heartbeat of movement, pushing away from the salt-choked ruins of the Euxine Lake. These travellers carry more than just their meagre possessions. They carry a profound, unsettling knowledge of how quickly the world can end. As the waters of the Mediterranean continued to pour through the Bosporus, turning a freshwater paradise into a saline abyss, the survivors did not merely flee. They drifted like seeds on a prehistoric wind, seeking soil that promised a permanence the coastlines had denied them. They moved toward the setting sun, following the silver ribbon of the Danube River, a liquid highway that led deep into the mysterious, untamed heart of Europe. The Danube Valley became a sanctuary for these displaced souls, a corridor of green and gold that stretched toward the horizon. Here, the geography of the continent offered a different kind of life, one defined by the steady flow of river currents rather than the unpredictable violence of a rising sea. As they moved inland, these refugees of the deluge brought with them the secrets of the Neolithic revolution, the art of the seed and the management of the herd. They carried small leather pouches filled with emmer wheat and einkorn, seeds that had been carefully selected over generations in the fertile loams of the Anatolian Plateau and the Black Sea Basin. In their wake, the landscape began to transform. The dense, ancient canopies of Central Europe were pierced by the first clearings of permanent settlements, as the newcomers applied their sophisticated understanding of agriculture to the rich, loamy soils of the riverbanks. This was a meeting of two worlds, a quiet collision between those who lived for the hunt and those who lived for the harvest. For millennia, the vast forests of Europe had been the domain of indigenous hunter-gatherer groups, people who moved with the seasons and the migrations of the red deer, living in a delicate, shifting harmony with the wild. We can only wonder what these forest dwellers thought as they watched the strangers emerge from the mists of the east. The newcomers were different. They stayed in one place. They spoke of a great water that had swallowed the world, and they possessed the strange power to make the earth provide food in abundance. There is a profound mystery in this intersection of cultures, a period of deep time where the old ways of the Paleolithic met the structured innovations of the new Stone Age. Archaeologists look to the stratigraphy, the layers of earth that act as a silent diary of the planet, to understand this transition. In the soil of the Balkans and the Carpathian Basin, we see a sudden shift in the archaeological record. The simple stone tools of the foragers are joined by the sophisticated, polished axes and intricate pottery of the linear band ceramic culture, often called the LBK. This name refers to the distinctive linear patterns etched into their ceramic vessels, a visual language of lines and spirals that perhaps echoed the flowing waters they had left behind. Through radiocarbon dating, a method that measures the decay of carbon isotopes to pinpoint the age of organic remains, we can trace the rapid spread of these farmers. It is as if a pulse of energy rippled outward from the Black Sea, moving at a speed that suggests more than just a gradual expansion. It suggests a necessity, a forced migration, driven by the loss of a homeland. The encounter between the refugees and the indigenous groups was likely not a single event, but a long, slow process of negotiation and adaptation. In some areas, the two groups may have lived side by side for centuries, exchanging ideas and perhaps even genes, as the DNA of modern Europeans still carries the echoes of this ancient mingling. The farmers brought stability, but they also brought a new way of thinking about the land, as something to be owned, shaped, and defended. The hunters, with their deep knowledge of the cycles of the forest, may have looked upon the tilled fields with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Yet the pressure of the rising waters in the east had set something in motion that could not be undone. The agricultural techniques that had once flourished on the shores of the Black Sea were now being planted in the valleys of the Rhine and the Elbe, forever altering the trajectory of human history. As the years passed, the memory of the deluge began to soften, turning from a lived trauma into a foundation myth. The children of the survivors grew up in the shadow of the Alps or the vast plains of the Hungarian Puszta, hearing stories of a great, sparkling lake that had turned into a monster. They learned to read the signs of the river, to respect the power of the flood, and to build their longhouses on the highest terraces. These longhouses, massive timber structures that could house entire extended families and their livestock, became the anchors of a new society. Inside the warmth of these wooden halls, as the firelight flickered against the decorated pottery, the stories of the old world were told and retold. The salt of the sea was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh-turned earth and wood smoke, but the psychological imprint of the displacement remained. One can imagine a group of elders sitting by the Danube, watching the river swell during the spring thaw. They would look at the water not just as a source of life, but as a potential bringer of ruin. This vigilance became a part of their culture, a quiet, persistent awareness of the fragility of human endeavor. They taught their young how to store grain for the lean years, how to read the clouds, and how to maintain the social bonds that would ensure survival when the environment turned hostile. The spread of agriculture was not just a technological shift, it was a survival strategy born from the most catastrophic event their ancestors had ever witnessed. It was an insurance policy against the whims of the gods and the shifting of the tides. The migration outward was not limited to the west. While many followed the Danube, others moved south into the rugged terrain of Greece or north toward the vast steppes of Eurasia. Each group carried a fragment of the lost Black Sea culture, like shards of a broken mirror, reflecting a common origin. In the mountain passes and the hidden valleys, they encountered different climates and different challenges, yet the core of their identity remained rooted in that moment of departure. The dispersal was a grand scattering of human potential, a forced diaspora that accelerated the development of Europe in ways we are only now beginning to map through the study of ancient genomes and the subtle clues left in the silt. We often think of history as a series of deliberate choices, but the Great Migration reminds us that we are often the playthings of the earth itself, a shift in a tectonic plate, a breach in a natural dam, a 1,000-year rise in temperature. These are the true architects of our destiny. The people moving through the European wilderness 6,000 years ago were not trying to build a continent. They were simply trying to find a place where the ground would stay dry and the crops would grow. They were looking for a home that wouldn't disappear overnight. In their search, they laid the foundations of the villages that would one day become cities, and the paths they trod would eventually become the roads of empires. There is a certain loneliness in this part of the story. The image of a small band of people standing on a ridge, looking out over a valley they have never seen before, knowing they can never go back. Behind them lies the salt and the silence of the drowned world. Before them lies a vast green uncertainty. They carry the weight of their ancestors' grief, but also the incredible resilience of the human spirit. As they descend into the valley to plant the first seeds of the season, they are writing the first chapter of a new era. The echoes of the Black Sea Deluge are not just found in the depths of the ocean, they are found in the very grain of the bread we eat and the layout of the landscapes we inhabit. The migration was a bridge between what was and what would be, a journey fueled by loss, but defined by the relentless, quiet pursuit of a future. The ink of the scribe is a curious thing, a liquid memory that captures the whispers of the past before they can vanish into the dry desert air. In the ancient city of Shurupak, thousands of years after the waters of the Mediterranean first breached the Bosporus sill, a poet presses a reed stylus into wet clay, carving the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform. He is not writing of the present, but of a time so distant it feels like a dream, a time when the gods grew weary of the clamour of humanity and decided to wash the world clean. This is the story of Utnapishtim, the man who survived the great storm, a figure who stands as a haunting literary shadow of those real, flesh-and-blood families who once fled the rising tides of the Black Sea. As we look back through the layers of time, what archaeologists call stratigraphy, the study of the Earth's historical skin, we see a strange and beautiful alignment between the mythic and the material. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the oldest story ever told, speaks of a terrifying deluge that lasted 7 days and 7 nights, a wall of water that turned the landscape into a featureless sea. While the event at the Black Sea was a slow, relentless rise rather than a week-long storm, the psychological imprint is identical. To a farmer in 5600 BC, watching his ancestral grazing lands disappear beneath an encroaching salt-water horizon. The distinction between a flood and an apocalypse was non-existent. The world as they knew it was ending, and in the oral traditions that followed, that slow-motion catastrophe was sharpened into a singular, divine strike. The transmission of this story is a journey across thousands of miles and dozens of generations. As the refugees of the Black Sea moved south into the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, they brought with them more than just seeds and livestock. They brought the trauma of the water. They brought the memory of a vast, freshwater lake that had become a salt-choked tomb. In the quiet evenings around the fires of early Sumerian settlements, these stories would have been told and retold, shifting and changing like the silt in the Tigris. The salt of the Black Sea became the salt of the Persian Gulf, and the localized disaster of the Euxine Lake expanded to fill the boundaries of the known world. There is a profound weight to the concept of divine punishment that permeates these ancient texts. In the epic, the god Enlil is driven to madness by the uproar of mankind, a noise that prevents the heavens from sleeping. It is a poetic way of describing a world that has grown too crowded, too complex, and perhaps too disconnected from the natural order. When we consider the Black Sea Deluge through this lens, we see a reflection of the terrifying scale of the event. To the survivors, such a total transformation of the geography could not have been a mere accident of climate or geology. It had to be intentional. It had to be the work of a higher power, a cosmic rebalancing. The divine element of the flood stories represents the human mind trying to make sense of the senseless, trying to find a reason why the very earth beneath their feet had betrayed them. Utnapishtim is told by the god Enki to tear down his house and build a boat, to abandon possessions and save life. This instruction mirrors the agonizing choices made by the Neolithic people of the Black Sea Basin. As the water moved inland at a rate of sometimes a mile a day, there was no time to save the heavy grinding stones, the permanent timber dwellings, or the vast stores of grain. They had to choose what was essential. They had to carry the sparks of their culture in their hands and in their hearts. When Utnapishtim releases the birds, the dove, the swallow, and finally the raven, to find dry land, he is reenacting the desperate search for a new home that defined the migration patterns of the 6th millennium BC. The raven does not return, finding a place to rest, and in that moment the survivor knows that the world has begun again. We often think of history as a straight line, but it is more like a river that loops back upon itself. The motifs of the Gilgamesh flood, the warning from a sympathetic deity, the building of a vessel, the preservation of the seed of all living creatures, are not just literary devices. They are the echoes of a survival strategy. The vessel may not always have been a literal boat. For many, it was the social structure of the tribe, the shared knowledge that allowed them to navigate a changing environment. The preservation of the seed was the literal act of carrying emmer wheat and barley across the mountains of Anatolia into the plains of the south. Every time a Sumerian priest recited the lines of the epic, he was unknowingly honoring the resilience of ancestors who had outrun the breaking of the world. The mystery deepens when we look at the specific details of the Mesopotamian flood myth. The gods are described as being terrified by the very storm they unleashed, cowering like dogs against the walls of heaven. This suggests a disaster so immense that even the imagined rulers of the universe could not control it. It captures the sheer, overwhelming power of the Mediterranean breach. A flow of water 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls, roaring through the Bosporus with a sound that would have been audible for hundreds of miles. To those living nearby, it would have sounded like the earth itself was screaming. This was not a gentle tide, it was a physical manifestation of chaos. As the centuries turned into millennia, the memory of the Black Sea event became buried under layers of newer history, yet the story of the flood remained. It became a cultural touchstone, a way for humanity to process its own fragility. The Epic of Gilgamesh reminds us that even the greatest kings must face the reality of loss and the passage of time. Gilgamesh seeks out Utnapishtim to learn the secret of eternal life, but instead he is told the story of the flood, a story of how everything can be taken away in a single moment. It is a humbling realization, one that would have resonated deeply with the descendants of the deluge. They knew that the land was not a permanent fixture, but a gift that could be reclaimed by the sea at any time. The parallels between the geological evidence and the mythic narrative suggest that our oldest stories are far more than mere fables. They are a form of deep time record-keeping. While radiocarbon dating, the method of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic material, gives us a timeline of 7,500 years. The epic gives us the emotional truth of that timeline. It tells us how it felt to see the horizon disappear. It tells us of the grief of losing a homeland and the strange, hollow relief of surviving when so much was lost. The measured pace of the narrator in the ancient poem reflects the slow, steady heartbeat of a people who have walked a long way to find peace. In the silence of the Mesopotamian ruins, one can almost hear the ghost of the water. The mud bricks of Uruk and Ur were made from the very silt that the floods left behind, a physical reminder that civilization is often built upon the wreckage of what came before. The Black Sea Deluge was a catalyst, a violent push that forced humanity to innovate, to migrate, and to remember. And so, the story of Utnapishtim survives, carved in clay and etched into our collective consciousness, a testament to the day the Mediterranean broke the world and, in doing so, forced us to become the storytellers we are today. The echoes are still there, if we listen closely enough, drifting through the verses of the world's first masterpiece, waiting to be recognized by those who study the deep and silent past. Imagine a single, heavy drop of rain falling against the parched slopes of Mount Ararat, a mountain that stands as a silent, snow-capped sentinel over the borderlands where Turkey, Armenia, and Iran meet. For centuries, this peak has been shrouded in a peculiar kind of gravity, a weight of expectation that transcends its geological reality. It is here, according to the ancient Hebrew texts, that a great wooden vessel finally came to rest as the waters of a global catastrophe began to recede. But as we look down from these high, thin altitudes toward the vast, dark expanse of the Black Sea to the north, the lines between scripture and stratigraphy, the study of rock layers and their chronological sequence, begin to blur into a single haunting image. In the late 20th century, two geologists from Columbia University, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, began to pull at a loose thread in the fabric of our planet's history. They looked at the shell fragments and the drowned shorelines at the bottom of the Black Sea and saw more than just a rising tide. They saw the blueprint for a legend. Their theory suggests that the deluge was not a slow, creeping transition, but a singular, world-shattering event that occurred roughly 7,500 years ago. They proposed that as the Mediterranean surged through the Bosporus, it did not merely fill a basin, it obliterated a world. And in the aftermath of that destruction, the survivors fled in every direction, carrying with them a trauma so profound that it could only be preserved in the amber of myth. As these refugees moved south and east, the towering silhouette of Ararat would have been one of the first landmarks to greet them, a massive, unchanging anchor in a world that had literally dissolved beneath their feet. To a farmer who had seen his valley vanish under a mile of salt water, the sight of a mountain that pierced the clouds must have felt like the only stable thing left in creation. It is not difficult to imagine how the memory of the flood and the sight of the mountain became inextricably linked. How the story of the great boat, the Ark, found its final mooring in the shadow of those volcanic peaks. The geography of the region supports this unfolding drama, as the drainage basins of the Black Sea and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are separated by relatively narrow corridors of land, pathways that ancient feet would have trodden as they sought higher, drier ground. The Ryan-Pittman theory invites us to reconsider the nature of cultural memory, to wonder if a story can act as a vessel for a literal, physical truth across hundreds of generations. We often think of myths as fabrications or metaphors, but in the silence of the deep past, they may function more like a long-distance radio signal carrying the distorted but recognizable frequency of a real event. When the Mediterranean broke through the earthen dam at the Bosporus, the sound would have been a roar that could be heard for hundreds of miles. A relentless, low-frequency vibration that would have felt like the earth itself was screaming. For those living on the fertile plains of the freshwater lake that preceded the Black Sea, this was not just a flood, it was the end of time. As the years passed and the waters stabilized, the survivors would have gathered around fires in distant lands, trying to find words for the impossible. They would have spoken of a day when the sea rose up and swallowed the sun, when the foundations of the deep were broken. Through the process of oral tradition, the specific technical details of the Bosporus breach might have faded, replaced by the more relatable imagery of 40 days and 40 nights of rain. But the core of the experience remained, the suddenness, the helplessness, and the desperate need for a sanctuary. The Ark, in this light, becomes more than just a ship. It is a symbol of human resilience, a container for the seeds of a future that had almost been extinguished. Scientists often speak of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling and subsequent warming that occurred near the end of the last ice age, as a time of chaotic environmental shifts. It was during these windows of instability that the great meltwater pulses occurred, shifting the weight of the oceans and rearranging the coastlines of the world. In the context of the Black Sea, the radiocarbon dating of shells found in the deep sediment cores suggests a timeline that aligns with the early development of agricultural societies in the Near East. These were people who had just begun to settle, to plant, and to build, people who had something to lose. The deluge was not just a natural disaster, it was a societal fracture that forced a massive, unplanned migration of skills, languages, and beliefs. And so, the Genesis connection is not merely a matter of finding wood on a mountaintop or matching a date in a book. It is about recognizing the echoes of a shared human experience. The trauma of the Black Sea Deluge may have acted as a catalyst for the spread of civilization itself, pushing people out of their isolated valleys and into a wider, more interconnected world. As they moved, they took their stories with them, weaving the memory of the flood into the very fabric of their new cultures. The similarities between the Sumerian accounts of Utnapishtim and the Hebrew accounts of Noah are not necessarily evidence of one culture copying another, but rather of multiple witnesses describing the same terrifying reality from different perspectives. We must ask ourselves, how much of our history is written in the language of catastrophe? We tend to view the progress of humanity as a steady, upward climb, but the evidence suggests it is more like a series of frantic leaps, spurred on by the shifting moods of the earth. The Black Sea Basin, once a lush and sheltered garden, became a graveyard of drowned villages and submerged forests, preserved in the cold, anoxic depths, where no oxygen can reach to decay the wood or the bone. Down there in the dark, the physical evidence of the deluge remains remarkably intact, waiting for the slow, methodical tools of modern archaeology to bring it back into the light. Meanwhile, on the surface, we continue to tell the stories. We look at the rainbow and see a promise, or we look at the ruins of an ancient city and see a warning. But perhaps the most profound connection is the one we feel in our own bones, a lingering ancestral fear of the rising tide and a deep-seated respect for the power of the water. The Genesis story serves as a bridge between the world that was and the world that is, a way for us to touch the edges of a time when the map was being redrawn by the hand of the sea. As we dwell on these deep time scales, the distinctions between science and legend begin to seem less important than the truth they both attempt to convey. Whether we call it a catastrophic marine transgression or a divine judgment, the event remains the same, a moment of total transformation that redefined the human relationship with the planet. The Mediterranean did not just break the world, it broke the silence of the past, forcing us to listen to the stories that have been whispered across 7 millennia. And as the narrator of this history, I find myself wondering what other secrets are held in the silt, what other names for the flood are waiting to be rediscovered in the layers of the earth. The mountain of Ararat continues to watch over the landscape, its peaks often hidden by the very clouds that once brought the rain. It stands as a monument to the endurance of memory, a place where the physical and the spiritual collide. If the Ryan Pittman theory is the key that unlocks the door to this mystery, then the Genesis connection is the hallway that leads us deeper into the heart of our own origins. We are the children of the survivors, the descendants of those who watched the horizon disappear and had the courage to keep walking, and so we listen to the echoes, drifting through the verses of the world's oldest stories, waiting to be recognized by those who understand that the past is never truly gone. It is only waiting to be remembered. Beneath the surface of the Black Sea, the water does not behave as it does in the rest of the world's oceans. It is a world of layers, a liquid cake of time where the top remains light and full of life, while the bottom sinks into a heavy, eternal stillness. To understand what lies waiting in the dark, one must understand the chemistry of the abyss. Most bodies of water are churned by currents and oxygenated by the wind, allowing life to thrive and eventually allowing the scavengers of the deep to consume whatever falls to the floor. But here, the density of the salt water that poured in from the Mediterranean created a permanent seal. The lighter, fresher water of the rivers floats on top, never mixing with the heavy, saline depths. This has created an anoxic environment, a realm where oxygen simply does not exist. In this oxygen-free graveyard, the normal rules of decay have been suspended for thousands of years. There are no shipworms to bore into ancient timber, no bacteria to feast on the organic remnants of the past. It is a place where time has been held in a state of perfect, icy arrest. When the explorer Robert Ballard first turned his cameras toward these depths, he was not merely looking for shipwrecks. He was looking for the very edge of the world that existed before the flood. And what he found was a shoreline. Not a shoreline of the modern day, but a drowned coast, resting hundreds of feet below the waves. This submerged beach, complete with its own shells and smooth-worn stones, serves as a silent witness to the exact moment the world changed. It is a preserved memory of a time when the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, surrounded by fertile plains that are now lost to the crushing weight of the sea. As the remote-operated vehicles drifted through the darkness, their lights cutting through the silt like lanterns in a fog, they began to encounter ghosts. These were not the shattered skeletons of ships we are used to seeing in the Atlantic or the Caribbean. These were vessels that looked as though they had sunk only yesterday. The preservation is so absolute that the grain of the wood is still visible, the coils of rope still hold their shape, and the very chisel marks of the ancient shipwrights remain sharp and clear. Some of these ships date back to the Roman and Byzantine eras, but others go back much further, into the misty centuries of the Bronze Age and perhaps even earlier. They sit upright on the seabed, their masts still pointing toward a sun they haven't seen in 2,000 years. It is a haunting sight, a fleet of the dead sailing through a sea that has forgotten how to breathe. One cannot help but wonder what else is down there, hidden in the layers of fine grey silt that have settled over the millennia. In the year 2000, Ballard's team discovered evidence of human habitation at a depth of over 300 feet. They found what appeared to be a rectangular structure, a collapsed dwelling made of wood and clay, preserved by the same anoxic conditions that saved the ships. This is the heart of the mystery. If the ships could survive, then the homes, the tools, and perhaps even the remains of the people who lived along that ancient shoreline might still be there, waiting in the dark. These artifacts are not just wood and stone, they are the physical echoes of the Younger Dryas, that period of intense cooling and subsequent warming that reshaped the planet, the stratigraphy. The study of these layers of earth and water tells the story of a sudden, violent transition. One day, there were meadows and freshwater springs. The next, there was only the encroaching salt. The deep sea graveyard is a library of organic history. In the Mediterranean, a wooden bowl or a leather sandal would vanish within decades, consumed by the hungry life of the sea. But in the Black Sea's lower depths, such items could theoretically last for 10,000 years. We are looking at a time capsule that spans the entirety of human civilization. As we peer through the cameras into that blue-black void, we are forced to confront the limits of our own knowledge. We have mapped the surface of the moon and the plains of Mars, yet here, just a few miles from the bustling ports of Turkey and Bulgaria, lies a lost world that we are only beginning to glimpse. It is a place of profound silence, a place where the past is not a story told in books, but a physical reality that you can almost touch. The expeditions led by Ballard and those who followed him have provided the first real evidence that the flood myths were not born of thin air. By using radiocarbon dating, a process that measures the decay of carbon atoms to determine the age of organic material, scientists have been able to date the shells found on that submerged shoreline. The results point to a specific window of time, roughly 7,500 years ago, when the freshwater species were suddenly replaced by saltwater ones. This is the biological fingerprint of the deluge. It is the moment the door broke open. And as the years pass and our technology improves, we find ourselves drawn back to these depths again and again. We are like children leaning over the edge of a well, staring into the darkness and hoping to see our own reflection staring back. The preservation of these ships and structures challenges our understanding of how quickly history can be buried. We often think of the past as something that fades away, dissolving into dust and memory. But in the anoxic depths, the past is stubborn. It refuses to disappear. It waits in the cold under the immense pressure of the water for someone to bring it back into the light. The wooden beams of those ancient houses, once part of a thriving community, now serve as the foundation for a new kind of archaeology, one that does not require a shovel but a lens and a light. We are learning to read the language of the deep, interpreting the patterns of the silt and the orientation of the wrecks to reconstruct the final moments of a world that didn't know it was about to end. As we contemplate these drowned landscapes, the mind naturally wanders to the people who once walked those shores. Did they have time to gather their belongings, or did they flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs? The presence of these preserved structures suggests a suddenness that is difficult to fathom. It is a reminder that the earth is not a static place, but a living, changing entity that can reclaim its territory in the blink of an eye. The Black Sea is a mirror of our own fragility, a vast, dark reminder that everything we build, everything we cherish, is ultimately subject to the whims of the planet, and yet there is a strange comfort in the preservation. Even if the people are gone, their work remains. Their ships, their homes, their very presence is etched into the floor of the sea, held in a cold embrace that defies the passage of time. Meanwhile, the currents far above continue to churn, and the sun continues to rise and set over the modern coastline, oblivious to the secrets held below. The deep-sea graveyard is not just a place of death, it is a place of profound preservation. It is a sanctuary for the things we have lost, a vault where the history of the human spirit is kept safe from the elements. As we continue to explore this silent realm, we find ourselves moving closer to the truth of our origins. We are beginning to see that the legends of old were not just fantasies, but attempts to describe a reality that was too vast and too terrifying to be captured in simple words. The ships in the dark are the punctuation marks in a story that is still being written. A story of survival, of loss, and of the enduring power of memory. The weight of the ages feels heavy here in the stillness of the anoxic zone. It is a weight that we all carry, whether we realize it or not. The weight of the thousands of generations that came before us, whose lives were shaped by the same winds and the same waters. We are the inheritors of their world, and their secrets are our secrets. As we look upon the wooden ribs of a ship that hasn't seen the sky in 7 millennia, we are reminded that we are part of a long, unbroken chain of existence. The sea may have taken their world, but it has also kept it for us, hidden in the depths, waiting for the moment when we are ready to remember. And so we continue to watch and to wait as the lights of our machines dance across the silt, revealing the faces of a past that is no longer lost, but merely sleeping. Deep beneath the keel of the research vessel, where the light of the sun has not touched the earth in eons, lies a library of mud. It is a soft grey archive, composed of the steady rain of organic debris that has fallen through the water column for thousands of years. To the untrained eye, it is merely silt, a featureless void of sediment. But to those who know how to read the language of the earth, these layers are the pages of a book, bound in the pressure of the deep and written in the remains of the very small. As the core samples are pulled from the darkness and brought into the sterile light of the laboratory, a startling story begins to emerge. In the deepest, oldest layers of the seafloor, the sediment is filled with the delicate, translucent shells of the Dreissena, a tiny, thumb-shaped mollusk that can only survive in the fresh, cool waters of a lake. For thousands of years, these creatures lived and died in a vast, landlocked basin, unaware of the salt-heavy giants that churned beyond the distant hills of the Bosporus. They are the silent witnesses to a world that was quiet, stable, and sweet to the taste. But then, the record changes. There is a line in the mud, a sharp and unmistakable boundary, known as a stratigraphic break. Above this line, the freshwater shells vanish as if they were never there. They are replaced, almost instantly, in the grand scale of geological time, by the Mytilus galloprovincialis, the common Mediterranean mussel. These are creatures of the brine, organisms that thrive in the stinging salt of the open ocean. Between these two worlds, there is no slow blending, no long period of brackish transition where both species struggled to find a middle ground. There is only the before and the after. To understand the timing of this transformation, scientists turn to the steady, rhythmic ticking of carbon-14. This process, known as radiocarbon dating, measures the decay of carbon isotopes within organic matter, a clock that begins to wind down the moment a living thing ceases to breathe. When the shells from that thin, dark transition layer are tested, the results point consistently to a window of time roughly 7,500 years ago. It is a date that anchors the myth in the realm of the physical. It tells us that the change was not a slow creep of rising tides over millennia, but a sudden, punctuating event that redefined the chemistry of an entire sea. As we contemplate these findings, we find ourselves standing at the center of a great geological debate, a quiet war of words played out in the halls of academia. On one side are the gradualists, who suggest that the Mediterranean seeped into the Black Sea over the course of centuries, a slow and perhaps manageable rise that allowed the inhabitants of the shoreline to gather their belongings and move to higher ground. They look at the same mud, the same shells, and see a process of steady change, a long, slow drowning that gave the world time to adapt. On the other side stand the catastrophists, who look at the sharpness of that boundary in the silt and see something far more violent. They envision a day when the natural dam of the Bosporus finally failed, unable to withstand the weight of the rising oceans as the great ice sheets of the north melted away. In their view, the water did not seep, it roared. They imagine a waterfall with the force of 200 Niagaras, a thundering wall of white water that tore through the earth, carving a canyon through the rock and dumping cubic miles of salt water into the basin every single day. In this version of history, the level of the sea would have risen by feet, not inches, every 24 hours, reclaiming miles of inhabited coastline in a single week. The weight of this evidence invites us to wonder how such an event would have felt to those who lived through it. Imagine a farmer tending to his fields in the fertile basin miles from the shore. Perhaps he noticed a change in the air first, a scent of salt and spray carried on a wind that had always been sweet. Perhaps he noticed the birds, thousands of them, fleeing inland in a panicked, screaming cloud, and then the sound. A low rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in the soles of his feet, the distant roar of a world being torn apart. By the time the water reached his doorstep, it would have been too late to save the harvest, too late to save the home. There would be only the flight toward the mountains, looking back to see the horizon itself advancing. A shimmering, blue-black wall that swallowed the familiar landmarks of his life. The debate over the speed of the flood is more than just a technicality of geology. It is a question of how trauma is etched into the collective memory of our species. A slow rise is a footnote in history, but a catastrophe is a story. A catastrophe is something that is whispered around fires for 100 generations, a warning that the earth is not as solid as it seems. We see the echoes of this trauma in the way the sediment is layered, a chaotic mix of sand and broken shells that suggests a period of immense turbulence before the deep, quiet silt of the saltwater era began to settle. As we peer closer at these microscopic remains, we find that the transition occurred during a period of global cooling known as the Younger Dryas, a time when the Earth seemed to be slipping back into the grip of the ice. It was a time of instability, of shifting climates and unpredictable seas. The Black Sea Deluge was not an isolated incident, but a single chord in a much larger, more complex symphony of planetary change. It reminds us that the boundaries between land and sea are never permanent. They are merely the current state of a long-running negotiation between the heat of the sun and the cold of the poles. There is a certain peace in the laboratory, a stillness that mirrors the depth from which these samples came. The scientists move with a measured pace, documenting the curve of a shell or the texture of a grain of sand, piecing together a mosaic of a lost world. They are the translators of the Earth's silence. Every grain of pollen trapped in the mud tells of the forests that once lined the freshwater lake, oaks and pines that have been gone for 7,000 years. Every trace of oxygen isotopes tells of the temperature of the water on the day it all changed. And yet, for all our instruments and all our data, there is a limit to what the mud can tell us. It can tell us the when and the how, but it cannot tell us the who. It cannot capture the sound of a mother calling to her child as the waters rose, or the look in the eyes of a village elder as he watched the sacred groves disappear beneath the waves. The science gives us the skeleton of the event, but the spirit of it remains hidden in the shadows of the deep. We are left to contemplate the vastness of the time that has passed since that line was drawn in the sediment. 7 millennia is a span that defies easy comprehension. It is a distance of time so great that entire empires have risen, flourished, and crumbled to dust in the interval. The people who fled the flood did not know they were living at the dawn of what we call civilization. They only knew that their world had ended and that they had to find a new one. As we look at the shells of the Dreissena and the Mytilus resting side by side in a glass vial, we are reminded that we are all living on the edge of change, and that the earth keeps a perfect record of everything we lose. The silence of the sea floor is a heavy thing, a weight of water and time that presses down on the secrets of the past. But as we continue to probe the darkness, as we continue to pull the stories from the mud, we find that the past is not as far away as it seems. It is right beneath us, held in the gentle embrace of the silt, waiting for the light of our curiosity to bring it back to life. And so we listen to the shells, and we watch the ticking of the carbon clock, and we wait for the next page to be turned in the long, slow history of the world. Imagine the scent of salt air meeting the sweet, cool breath of a mountain lake for the very first time. It is a chemical collision, a silent war of elements that signals the end of one world and the slow, agonizing birth of another. As the Mediterranean torrents finally began to level out, the basin was no longer the isolated refuge it had been for thousands of years. The turquoise waters of the world ocean had claimed the valley, and with that claim came a total transformation of the very essence of the water itself. For the creatures that had called the Euxine Lake home, this was not merely a flood, it was an atmospheric collapse. The freshwater fish, the delicate mollusks, and the lush underwater forests of weeds that thrived in low salinity environments found themselves suddenly submerged in a brine that burned. They could not breathe this new, heavy water. They could not survive the minerals it carried from the distant Atlantic. And so, in a tragedy that spanned years rather than days, the original inhabitants of the lake began to perish. Their remains drifted down through the darkening water column, settling in layers upon the newly drowned villages and the abandoned hearths of men. This mass mortality created a carpet of organic matter, a thick layer of silty memory that would eventually become a treasure trove for future scientists. As the years passed, the surface of the Black Sea began to shimmer with new life. Marine species from the Mediterranean, dolphins, mackerel, and hardy saltwater shellfish followed the current through the Bosporus, colonizing the vast new territory. They brought with them the rhythms of the open sea, turning the once quiet lake into a vibrant extension of the global ocean. Yet, beneath this newfound vitality, a strange and ghostly phenomenon was taking hold. The sheer volume of the salt water, being much denser and heavier than the original lake water, did not mix well with the runoff from the northern rivers, like the Danube and the Dnieper. Instead of a uniform body of water, the Black Sea began to separate into distinct layers, a process known as stratification. The lighter, fresher water from the rivers stayed near the top, absorbing oxygen from the atmosphere and supporting the new marine ecosystem. But the heavy, salty Mediterranean water sank to the bottom, trapped beneath a boundary that no sunlight could penetrate and no oxygen could reach. This transition zone, which we call the pycnocline, became a shimmering wall between the living and the dead. Below this line, the water became stagnant and anoxic, devoid of the oxygen that allows for decay. In these lightless depths, the normal cycle of life and death was suspended. The bacteria that usually break down wood, flesh, and fibre could not survive. The deep world became a giant liquid sarcophagus, a place where time itself seemed to lose its grip on physical matter. As the centuries stretched into millennia, this lack of oxygen created an environment of unparalleled preservation. While the surface world weathered storms, wars, and the rise and fall of empires, the depths remained eerily still, A ship that sank 3,000 years ago in these waters would not rot away. Its masts might still stand tall, its ropes might still be coiled, and the very grain of the wood might remain as sharp as the day it was hewn from the forest. This environmental stability is perhaps the greatest gift the cataclysm left behind for us. It turned a scene of prehistoric destruction into a library of deep time, where the artifacts of lost civilizations are kept in a state of perpetual arrest. We often think of the earth as a place of constant change, where the wind and the rain eventually erase all traces of our existence, but here, in the cold, dark pressure of the anoxic zone, the earth has a long memory. Meanwhile, on the shores of this new sea, the climate began to find a fresh equilibrium. The massive influx of water had altered the local weather patterns, bringing more moisture to the surrounding hills and changing the migration routes of animals. The people who returned to the coast generations later found a landscape that looked familiar but felt fundamentally different. The marshes where their ancestors had hunted were now deep bays. The islands where they had gathered eggs were now submerged peaks, hidden beneath hundreds of feet of brine. The environment had stabilized, but it was a stability born of a profound loss. The new Black Sea, as geologists call this phase of the basin's life, was a more predictable neighbor than the volatile lake of the Younger Dryas, that period of sudden cooling and drying that had plagued the world at the end of the last ice age. The stratification of the water column acted as a lid, keeping the secrets of the flood safely tucked away from the prying eyes of the sun. Even the chemistry of the mud changed, shifting from the pale sandy clays of the freshwater era to a dark organic ooey rich in hydrogen sulfide. This gas, smelling faintly of sulfur, is the breath of the deep sea, a warning to the living that this is a realm where they do not belong. And yet, for the archaeologist, that smell is a promise. It is the scent of a place where the oxygen-driven hunger of time has been thwarted. As we look out over the calm, dark waters of the modern Black Sea, it is difficult to imagine the chaos that once reigned here. We see a peaceful expanse, a highway for modern ships and a playground for tourists. But the stability we enjoy today is a thin veneer. Beneath the waves, the stratification remains. The dead zones still sprawl across the seafloor, silent and unchanging. It is a reminder that the earth does not heal from its wounds so much as it incorporates them into a new design. The cataclysmic birth of the sea created a unique ecosystem that exists nowhere else on this scale. A two-story world where the top floor is full of light and movement, and the basement is a silent gallery of the forgotten. We are only just beginning to understand the long-term implications of this environmental shift. How did the sudden change in water weight affect the tectonic plates below? Did the cooling effect of such a massive body of water play a role in the stabilization of European agriculture? The questions remain, floating like mist over the water's surface. As the years passed and the memory of the flood moved from eyewitness accounts into the realm of myth, the sea itself became a constant, unchanging presence. It became the boundary of the known world for the Greeks, the Romans, and the Byzantines. They sailed its surface, unaware that just a few hundred feet beneath their keels, the world of the first farmers was still there, perfectly preserved in the dark. They saw the sea as a bridge between lands, never realizing it was a shroud over a lost history. The environmental stability that followed the deluge allowed for the rise of the great coastal civilizations, but it also ensured that the evidence of their predecessors would be kept in a vault of salt and silt. The stratification of the Black Sea is a testament to the power of water to both destroy and protect. It is a paradox of nature. The very event that wiped out an entire way of life also created the perfect conditions to remember it. The oxygen-rich surface gave life to the future, while the oxygen-starved depths held on to the past with a grip that has not loosened in 7,000 years. We find ourselves standing on the edge of this vast, watery archive, peering into the gloom and wondering what else is hidden in the layers. Every core sample pulled from the bottom, every sonar sweep of the submerged shelf reveals a bit more of the story. We see the transition from freshwater shells to saltwater ones as a clear line in the mud, a physical mark of the day the world changed. And so, we wait. We wait for the technology to catch up with our curiosity, for the means to explore the anoxic depths without disturbing the fragile peace of the ruins. We move with a measured pace, respecting the silence of the deep. For in the Black Sea, the past is not a ghost. It is a physical presence, resting in the cold, waiting for the light to finally reach it. The ecosystem that emerged from the flood is more than just a biological curiosity. It is a guardian of human heritage, a silent sentinel that has watched over the secrets of the deluge since the first drop of salt water crossed the threshold of the Bosporus. As we continue our journey into the dark, we do so with the knowledge that the sea does not give up its secrets easily. But when it does, it speaks in a voice that echoes across the millennia. The sound of water against stone is one of the oldest rhythms of the world, a constant heartbeat that has echoed through the Bosporus since that first cataclysmic breach. It is a strange irony that this site of ancient devastation, where a freshwater lake was violently transformed into a saline sea, eventually became the most vital artery of the human world. The very gateway that once poured ruin upon the coastal settlements of the Neolithic became in time the golden horn of commerce, a narrow throat through which the wealth of empires would flow for thousands of years. We find ourselves looking at a landscape where the ghosts of the drowned past are layered beneath the hulls of triremes, galleys, and merchant vessels, creating a vertical timeline of human ambition stacked atop a foundation of prehistoric tragedy. As the salt water stabilized and the new coastline took its permanent shape, the Black Sea ceased to be a site of fleeing tribes and began to transform into a hub of connectivity. It was as if the earth, having finished its violent upheaval, offered up this inland sea as a gift to the navigators of the future. The Greeks were among the first to recognize the potential of this dark, deep basin, though they approached it with a mixture of reverence and dread. They called it the Pontus Euxenos, or the Hospitable Sea, a name that many historians believe was a linguistic charm intended to appease the volatile spirits of the water. To the Hellenic mind, the Black Sea was the edge of the known world, a place where Jason and his Argonauts sought the golden fleece along the rugged shores of Colchis. They built their colonies like pearls on a string, Sinope, Trapezus, Byzantium, clinging to the edges of a sea that they knew held depths no anchor could reach. It is a quiet thought to consider a Greek sailor resting his hand on the wooden rail of his ship, looking down into the blue-black expanse and having no inkling that hundreds of feet below his keel lay the preserved rafters of a farmhouse or the stone tools of a people who had watched the same stars 6,000 years before him. The strategic importance of the Bosporus cannot be overstated. It is a geographic needle's eye. Whoever controlled this narrow passage held the key to the transition between the Mediterranean world and the vast, fertile steppes of the north. As the Roman Empire expanded its reach, the Black Sea became a vital granary, a maritime highway that fed the hungry masses of the Eternal City. The grain ships moved in a slow, steady procession, their sails catching the same winds that had once carried the spray of the Great Flood. The Romans, with their penchant for engineering and order, mapped these coasts with a precision that the drowned ancestors could never have imagined, yet even they were humbled by the sea's sudden storms and its deceptive stillness. As the centuries drifted by, like silt settling on the seabed, the seat of power shifted to the shores of the Bosporus itself. The rise of Constantinople, the new Rome, turned this once wild gateway into the most fortified and coveted location on the planet. For the Byzantines, the Black Sea was not just a trade route, but a protective moat and a source of inexhaustible wealth. They watched from their high walls as the wealth of the Silk Road arrived at their docks, spices from the east, furs from the north, and slaves from the distant plains. The irony remains profound, that the very breach which may have scattered the first farmers of Europe and Asia eventually became the singular point where all their descendants returned to trade. The site of a diaspora became the ultimate site of convergence. We must wonder if the merchants of the Middle Ages ever felt the weight of what lay beneath them. By the time the Genoese and Venetian traders were competing for dominance in the ports of Crimea, the memory of the deluge had long since passed into the realm of myth, if it was remembered at all. They saw the Black Sea as a ledger of profit and loss, a surface to be crossed as quickly as possible. Yet the sea remained a perfect preservative. While the empires above rose and fell, while the cross was replaced by the crescent and the language of the docks shifted from Latin to Greek to Turkish, the wooden masts of sunken Byzantine trade ships remained upright in the anoxic depths. Because there is no oxygen in the lower layers of the Black Sea, the wood does not rot, the worms do not eat. There are ships resting on the floor of this sea that look as though they could have sunk yesterday, their ropes still coiled, their carvings still sharp, frozen in a state of perpetual waiting. This brings us to a deeper reflection on the nature of human progress. We often view history as a forward march, a series of stepping stones leading from the primitive to the sophisticated, but the Black Sea suggests a different pattern, a cycle of destruction and rebirth where the ruins of one era provide the foundation for the prosperity of the next. The Sea of Civilizations is a title earned through blood and gold, but its true character is defined by its silence. It is a massive, liquid archive. When we look at the stratigraphy, the study of the layers of earth and sediment of this region, we see a clear line of demarcation. Below the line, there is the evidence of a quiet, freshwater world. Above it, there is the sudden influx of Mediterranean species and the debris of 5,000 years of maritime commerce. The Bosporus itself acts as a temporal bridge. Every ship that passes through it today, from the massive oil tankers to the small fishing boats, is traversing a scar in the Earth's crust that changed the course of human destiny. If the flood had never happened, if the Mediterranean had stayed behind its rocky dam, the history of the world would be unrecognizable. There would be no Constantinople, no Silk Road terminus at the Black Sea, and perhaps no spread of agricultural techniques into the heart of Europe in the specific way that we have recorded. The disaster was the catalyst for the commerce. The trauma of the flood was the birth pang of the trade routes that defined the medieval and modern worlds. As we linger on this thought, the darkness of the deep water seems a little less cold. It is not just a graveyard of houses and trees, it is the basement of our modern house. We are drawn to these waters because they remind us of our own fragility and our incredible resilience. We are a species that builds on the wreckage of the past. We turn the sites of our greatest fears into the centers of our greatest achievements. The Black Sea, with its twin layers of water, the living, oxygen-rich surface and the dead, preserving depths, is a perfect metaphor for the human condition. We sail upon the present, fueled by the trade and movement of our daily lives, while just beneath us, the past remains perfectly intact, waiting for a moment when the light of inquiry might finally reach it. Was it the hand of fate that broke the ridge at the Bosporus, or merely the slow, indifferent pressure of a rising ocean? The answer may not matter as much as the result. The result was a world made smaller, a world where people were forced to move, to adapt, and eventually to return to the water that had once driven them away. The Greek myths of the flood of Deucalion and the stories of the great deluge in the epic of Gilgamesh may be the faint, distorted echoes of this very event, whispered through generations until they were written down in clay and stone. They are the psychological sediment of a trauma that transformed the human map forever. And so, we look out across the surface of the Euxine, watching the way the moonlight dances on the waves, knowing that the water is a veil. Beneath that veil lies a museum of the lost, a repository of the moments when the world ended for some and began anew for others. The strategic importance of this sea, from the time of the first Roman galley to the modern geopolitical struggles of the 21st century, is a testament to the power of geography over the human spirit. We are bound to this place. We are drawn to the threshold where the Mediterranean broke the world, for it is there that we find the clearest reflection of our own enduring story. The sea of civilizations is deep, and its waters are heavy with the weight of forgotten ages, but it continues to carry us forward into the unknown reaches of time.
It is often said that the oldest memories of our species are not held in books, but in the marrow of our bones and the quiet rhythms of our breath. When we look across the vast tapestry of human experience, we find a curious, recurring pattern that defies the boundaries of geography and the isolation of distant continents. From the high mountain plateaus of the Andes to the sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia, and from the lush islands of the Pacific to the cold, mist-shrouded forests of northern Europe, the story of a great deluge persists, a memory of a time when the world was swallowed by the deep. This is not merely a coincidence of storytelling, but a haunting echo that suggests a shared trauma, an ancient scar on the collective psyche of humanity that refuses to fade, even after thousands of years of progress and change. As we consider the Black Sea Deluge, we begin to realize that this event was perhaps the catalyst for a narrative that would eventually clothe itself in 1,000 different cultural garments, yet remain fundamentally the same at its core. The persistence of the flood myth suggests that we are a species defined by what we have lost. To the ancient mind, the rising of the waters was never just a meteorological event or a shift in the Earth's crust. It was a profound metaphor for the fragility of everything we build. The flood represents the ultimate reset, the moment when the chaos of the primordial ocean reclaims the order of the land. In these stories, the water is a cleansing force, a cold and relentless hand that washes away the old world to make room for the new. It is a narrative of rebirth, where the survivors carry the seeds of the past into a strange and silent future. We find ourselves drawn to these tales because they speak to a universal human fear, the fear of the encroaching sea, the knowledge that the ground beneath our feet is only ours for a little while, and that the tides of time are always, eventually, coming back for what they gave. In the quiet hours of the night, it is easy to imagine those early ancestors standing on the crumbling cliffs of the Bosporus, watching as the turquoise waters of the Mediterranean began to spill over the rock. They did not have the tools of modern stratigraphy, the study of rock layers that allows us to read the earth like a book, nor did they understand the complexities of radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon atoms to pinpoint the age of organic remains. To them, the world was not a series of geological processes, but a living, breathing entity that had suddenly turned hostile. As the salt water rushed into the freshwater lake below, drowning forests and burying villages under hundreds of feet of silt, the survivors fled in every direction. They carried with them more than just their tools and their livestock. They carried a story. They carried the terrifying realization that the world could end in a single afternoon, and that the sea, which had always been a source of life, could also be an engine of absolute destruction. This collective memory has traveled through the millennia, morphing as it moved. In some cultures,
The flood is a punishment from the gods for the hubris of man, while in others it is a natural cycle of the universe, as predictable as the changing of the seasons, though infinitely more devastating. Yet, regardless of the cause, the imagery remains strikingly consistent. The darkening sky, the roar of the rising tide, and the desperate scramble for higher ground. We see this reflected in the Epic of Gilgamesh, written on clay tablets in the dust of Sumer, and we see it in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples who have lived by the coast for tens of thousands of years. It is as if the human heart is hardwired to remember the sound of the water, a ghost frequency that hums beneath the surface of our modern lives. Perhaps the reason these stories resonate so deeply is that they touch upon our inherent vulnerability. We live on a planet that is mostly water, a blue marble spinning in the dark, and we have always clung to the edges of the dry land, building our cities and our dreams just out of reach of the spray. The flood myth acts as a mirror, showing us the limits of our control. It reminds us that for all our technology and our mastery over the environment, we are still subject to the vast, slow movements of the Earth's climate. During the period known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden, 1,000-year return to glacial conditions that gripped the planet at the end of the last ice age, the world was a place of radical instability. Glaciers melted, sea levels surged, and the map of the world was rewritten in a heartbeat of geological time. To those living through it, it must have felt as though the very foundations of reality were dissolving. As the years passed and the waters eventually settled into the basins we recognize today, the trauma of the deluge became codified into myth. It became a way to explain the unexplainable, a way to give meaning to the loss of entire civilizations that now lie beneath the waves, silent and forgotten. When we look at the ruins of ancient settlements discovered by underwater archaeologists, we are looking at the physical evidence of these myths. We see the stone hearths where families once gathered, the broken pottery that held their grain, and the submerged pathways that led to nowhere. These are the ghosts of the Black Sea, the silent witnesses to the day the world broke. And yet, the stories we tell are not entirely tragic. Within the flood myth, there is always the ark, the mountain peak, or the lone survivor who carries the fire of humanity forward. It is a testament to our resilience, the belief that even when the world is washed away, something essential remains. We find ourselves wandering through these memories, much like a traveller walking along a beach at low tide, looking for fragments of what the ocean has returned. We look at the rising sea levels of our own era and feel a strange sense of recognition. The fear of the water is not a new fear. It is an ancient one, a companion that has walked beside us since the first time the Mediterranean breached the barrier and turned a fertile valley into a salt-choked abyss. This shared history binds us to the people of the Neolithic, the first farmers who watched their world disappear. Their loss is our heritage. Their survival is the reason we are here to tell the story. The deep time of the earth is a vast and lonely place, and the flood is the bridge that connects us to it. It is the moment when the human timeline intersected with the immense, indifferent forces of nature, leaving a mark that would never be erased. As we sit in the stillness, listening to the imaginary pulse of that ancient tide, we realize that the flood myth is not just a story about the past. It is a reflection of our ongoing relationship with the world, a world that is beautiful and terrifying and constantly in flux. The waters of the Black Sea may have long since stilled, and the echoes of the great deluge may have softened into the whispers of folklore, but the weight of those forgotten ages remains. It is a weight we feel whenever we stand at the edge of the ocean, looking out at the horizon, wondering what secrets lie hidden in the dark, and what new worlds are waiting to be born from the depths of the old. The silence of the deep is not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of a profound, crushing weight, a stillness
that has been cultivated over thousands of years within the lightless corridors of the Euxine abyss. Below the churning surface where the fishing boats toss and the modern world hums with its electric anxieties, the Black Sea transforms into a liquid tomb of extraordinary preservation. Because the waters are stratified, divided into layers that do not mingle, the oxygen from the air never reaches the floor. It is an anoxic world, a place where the chemistry of decay has been arrested, leaving the wooden ribs of ancient vessels and perhaps the timber foundations of lost homes as pristine as the day they were swallowed by the salt. As the years passed, the scars of the great deluge were covered by a fine silken rain of sediment, a slow accumulation of dust and organic matter that falls through the water column like a never-ending snow. This is the stratigraphic record, the Earth's own diary, where every millimetre represents a season and every metre represents a millennium. Beneath this soft shroud, the remnants of the Neolithic world remain suspended in a state of permanent grace. The radiocarbon dating of shells and silt tells us when the Mediterranean first breached the Bosporus, but it cannot tell us the names of those who stood on the shore and watched their reality dissolve. It cannot describe the smell of the damp earth as the brine moved inland, or the specific grief of a family leaving behind a hearth that had warmed them for generations. We are left only with the physical echoes, the ghostly outlines of a geography that no longer exists except in the quietest corners of our ancestral memory. There is a strange comfort in the realization that the landscapes we inhabit are merely temporary arrangements of stone and soil. We walk upon ground that was once the floor of a sea, and we sail over valleys that were once lush with grass and the songs of birds. The Black Sea is a reminder that the borders between the elements are porous and shifting. The map is not a fixed document, but a single frame in a long, slow-motion film of planetary change. When we look at the bathymetry, the underwater topography of the northern shelf, we see the drowned riverbeds of the Danube and the Dnieper stretching out like withered veins across the submerged plains. They are the silent witnesses to a time when the world was wider and the horizon was a different shape entirely. The tides of history and the tides of the ocean share a rhythmic, eternal nature, an ebb and flow that cares little for the rise and fall of civilizations. As we sit in the quiet of the present, it is easy to forget that we are living through our own geological epoch, the Holocene, a brief, stable window that has allowed us to build our cities and tell our stories. But the stability is an illusion, born of our short lifespans. Deep time moves according to a different clock, one measured in the slow grinding of tectonic plates and the gradual melting of polar ice. The deluge was not an ending, but a transformation, a chaotic restructuring that paved the way for the world we recognize today. The salt water that brought destruction also brought connection, turning a secluded lake into a gateway that linked the heart of Eurasia to the vast interconnected network of the Mediterranean. And so, the sleeping sea remains, a dark mirror reflecting the transience of all things. The mysteries that lie 500 feet below the surface are protected by the very pressure that would crush us, kept safe in a cold, dark sanctuary where time has no meaning. We may send our remote-operated vehicles down into the gloom, their bright lights cutting through the murky green to illuminate a fragment of a hull or a curious mound of clay. But we are only catching glimpses of a narrative that is too vast for us to fully comprehend. The Black Sea does not give up its secrets easily. It cradles them in its salt-heavy arms, whispering them only to the currents that roam the abyss. As the night deepens and the world around us grows still, we can imagine the rhythmic pulse of the water against the shore, a sound that has remained unchanged since the first wave broke over the sill of the Bosporus. It is a lullaby of deep time, a song of endurance and inevitable change.
The landscapes will shift again, the waters will rise and fall, and the stories we tell today will one day become the folklore of a future we cannot see. There is a peace in this continuity, a sense of belonging to a process that is far older and more powerful than ourselves. The great deluge was a moment of terror, yes, but it was also a moment of creation, a washing away of the old to make room for the new. The water is cold, and the depths are vast, but there is no malevolence in the darkness, only the patient, unhurried breath of the earth. We are the children of the flood, the descendants of those who survived the breaking of the world and found a way to begin again on higher ground. Our history is written in the silt, and our future is carried on the tide. As we drift towards sleep, we carry with us the weight of those forgotten ages, not as a burden, but as a foundation, a reminder that even in the face of the overwhelming sea, life finds a way to endure, to adapt, and to eventually find its way back to the shore. The echoes of the Mediterranean's roar have long since faded into a gentle hum, the sound of a world at rest. The Black Sea remains a place of quiet contemplation, a sanctuary for the ghosts of the Neolithic and the dreams of the modern explorer. It is a reminder that under the surface of our everyday lives, there are depths we have yet to reach and stories we have yet to hear. But for now, the water is still. The sediment continues its slow silver descent through the dark. The world is ancient, and the night is long, and the sea is finally, peacefully, asleep.